Hi. So today we're going to talk about developments in medicine that relates to the development of psychology or that led to advancements, technological foundings, research methods, anything that related to what we now do in psychology. And so today again we're going to look specifically at medicine, and I want to first bring you back to a time. We're going to be talking about ancient Greece, and this is from like 6th to 4th century BC. And I want to talk a little bit about what that time period was like so that we have some contextual ideas of these advancements. So during this time, ancient Greece was really responsible for bringing forth all kinds of new advancements in literature, in art, in government, architecture, math, science. Everything was just spiraling at this time period. And in this, while all of this was happening and everything was, being created, being thought of, being brought into thin air, essentially, during this time, most people could not read or write. Writing was done still on wax tablets, so we didn't even have a printing press, but even that, we didn't really have like pen and paper or anything of that manner. And most people were not doing the writing since most couldn't write or read. There was no clocks, no watches, no lights, no electricity that we knew of. There was not even that many paved streets. Most people at this time were still forced into slavery conditions. So during all of this, we still had some advances in medicine, as well as other sciences we'll talk about in different videos, that really helped develop psychology in a way. So let's talk about those. So in 500 BC and even earlier, like we were talking about, most medicine was still administered by the church. So at this time period, the church was the main governing body of pretty much every country at the time. And they were the ones that were creating different techniques, different medicines, different ways of administering medicine. And they kept these closely guarded and secretive, and they were very selective on who they chose to administer medicine and treatment to. It was very expensive, so only people with wealth at the time could really afford a lot of these treatments. And again, they were very selective, very guarded in the methods, and so people outside of the church really didn't have an opportunity to seek this medical treatment. And so what happened, what started to change things from this time, one person that we'll talk about is Alcmaeon, and he really started looking at medicine through a physiological lens. And what we're going to talk about in a couple weeks is that with the founding of psychology is really rooted in physiology. Most of the initial founders of the discipline were in fact physiologists. Even Pavlov is a physiologist, not a psychologist. So we're going to see a lot of trends in physiology. So Alcmaeon is at this time starting to dissect animals and figuring out what parts of the nervous system, what parts of the body are influencing certain behaviors. So one thing he did was discovered the optic nerve by performing dissections on frogs. What he found was that there was a sense organ that would send perceptions to the brain, and then we would interpret them and derive ideas. Now, if you've taken a cognitive psychology, or even if you haven't, this is something that has been proven in psychology to be what we now call sensation and perception. So something comes in to any of our sensations. In this case, Alcmaeon is talking about the optic nerve. So the nerve going from the back of our eye up into our brain that takes what information we're taking in from the sensation. So the actual light reflection, the actual objects we're looking at, and changes that into perceptions, which essentially is the way that our brain interprets what we are sensing, and thus causes our thought patterns and our behaviors. So Alcmaeon, way back in 500 BC, is discovering this optic nerve and discovering a little bit how this works in terms of perception ability. And so even though he was technically incorrect in exactly what his emphasis of the perception source of knowledge was being, this was still really huge in our sense of understanding how physiology impacts how our brain works, how we interpret information, and how we then carry on with our behaviors. He also was really big at looking at objective observations. And in psychology today, we're really focused on trying to get to as objective as observations as we can. We'll talk later about how this is pretty difficult in psychology, but objective observations are observing what's happening with as minimal impact on what we're observing as possible. So we're trying to observe a phenomenon, and we don't want to release any of our biases, any of our ideas. We really just want to study that phenomenon in its natural state. And Alcmaeon was really pioneering this idea of let's try to study physiology in as objective as a manner as possible. So we will dissect things and we will figure out how the physiology works to understand how the brain and behavior and medicine in this case is working, but as objectively as possible, something that still carries on today. And our next big person that we'll talk about is Hippocrates. You might have heard of Hippocrates in terms of the Hippocratic Oath. And the Hippocratic Oath is an oath that medical professionals take that basically states that they will do no harm to a patient, no matter what, without regarding their biases, regarding anything. Their first line of business is to help the patient in whatever way possible, not to help themselves, not to help somebody else, but to do as little harm as possible. Now, people within counseling types of psychology don't necessarily take the Hippocratic Oath unless you are a psychiatrist, which is a form of medical school. So you would be an actual medical doctor and would take the Hippocratic Oath. But even though most clinicians don't take it per se, they are still operating under this ideology. So the Hippocratic Oath was definitely something big to come out of medicine that has impacted psychology. Hippocrates was the founder or the father of medicine. A cool fact is that he ended up curing the plague with fire, realizing that heat source helped reduce the virus. And something related to psychology that he studied in terms of medicine is this idea that he believed in exercise and diet and the healing power of nature over drugs and medicine. And what we've learned recently in psychology in the last 10 to 20 years is really the truth behind this. And it's not a cure-all. You're not going to see a patient with schizophrenia or with bipolar disorder or with severe clinical depression that can cure those things with a walk in nature or exercise, right? But for the typical normal, as we'll call it, I'll always have air quotes, person, exercise, diet, sleep, walking in nature, all of those things are actually related to positive mental health. And even walking in nature has actually recently been found to increase creativity even. So walking and nature, both independent, have been shown to increase creativity, both taken together, obviously increasing creativity. So we do know that increased exercise, a healthy, overall healthy diet, not completely strict, and being out in nature, taking a walk, things like that, we do know those are related to positive mental health. So something, again, from 400, 500 BC, that's really reflecting on what we know in psychology today. He also was the first to start divorcing medicine from religion. So as I mentioned in the beginning of this video, really medicine was controlled by the church at this time. And now Hippocrates is starting to take that away and start having more physiologists, more medicinal, more doctors take over our treatment, which is now what we see kind of today. He was one of the first ones to describe mental illness, to describe that there's something between the body and the brain that is influencing our mental health and our mental capacity. Something, again, we know a lot more now of in psychology, but at the time was kind of revolutionary that things that are happening inside of our brain could actually cause physiological responses, could cause different illnesses and different things like that. Something we're kind of still grappling with today. Again, we'll talk about that in a later video. And lastly, we're going to talk about Galen. So this is from 130 to about 200 AD. And Galen, another physiologist, was looking at different types of physiology, and he discovered what is considered now one of our very first personality theories. And this theory was based on Hippocrates, who had a theory about four humors. And even though there's a lot of incorrect assumptions, what we know about personality theory today, we would not say that Galen was correct, but it was the first attempt at trying to figure out what a personality theory is, who we are as people, and how we can kind of measure that. He was also one of the first people to talk about a patient-therapist, or in his case, a client-patient relationship, to understand that disease arises from different things, including in the body, and but also in the brain, and that the client or the patient and the doctor need to have some type of relationship that is built on trust in order to administer medicine appropriately. Something that we will talk a lot more about when we get to counseling, in this idea of a patient-therapist relationship and the importance of that relationship and that trust and that context. The other cool thing he figured out was something about physiological arousal. He noticed that a patient of his was a woman, and every time a certain male dancer appeared on a stage, she would get an elevated heart rate. So she kept coming in saying that her heart rate was elevated, and she needed to understand why. And he noticed that it happened anytime a male dancer came in. And so what he did was he conducted a little study, and he started bringing in different males into the room with the woman, and found that anytime there was some physical attraction on her part, her heart rate would be elevated. So this idea of our physiological arousal, that something that's happening in our mental state, a physical attraction, can actually change our bodily functions. Our heart rate will actually increase based off of this arousal. And something now we've studied way more in psychology. We even know what types of things can cause physiological arousal. We know that if you go on a date, making anything that increases your heart rate will actually help the other person be more attracted to you longer term. So tons of different theories within psychology that relate to this idea of physiological arousal. And so these are all some advances that were happening in medicine around these times that really influenced how we see things in psychology. So looking at physiology, looking at this brain-body, body-mind connection of how both are symbiotically influencing the other, and how to address that in any type of situation.